Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another in our NC Leap webinar series to support low wealth entrepreneurs in North Carolina. Today's topic will be business basics. We're presenting this topic both in English and Spanish. We'd like to welcome Tyler Moffitt and Luisa Gomez, who are joining us for today's presentation. Tyler is an attorney in Boone, North Carolina. He practices in business and corporate law, personal injury, civil litigation. He often works with small and medium-sized businesses across many industries in North Carolina and in Tennessee on issues like corporate formation, organization and restructuring, transactional matters, labor and employment, litigation, and intellectual property. Luisa is joining us as a first-year student at Duke Law School, where she is studying law and also is a bilingual law student. She will be doing the translation of the presentation today. We will make this presentation available as a recording on our website, along with the set of slides that Tyler will be sharing with us. Thank you for being here, Tyler and Luisa.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much. My name is Tyler Moffitt, and let me share my presentation screen if you give me just a moment. All right, I think that should be there. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about, as the title of the slide reflects, sort of the legal aspects of being an entrepreneur, being someone that owns their own business, some considerations that you should have.
Buenas tardes a todos. En esta clase vamos a hablar de los aspectos legales de negocios.
So the first question is, what does it mean to incorporate? The word incorporate has a more general meaning that is to organize a business venture into some formal entity.
¿Qué significa incorporar? En general, incorporar significa organizar su negocio en una manera que sea una entidad separada y distinta para los ojos de la ley.
Before we get into what exactly incorporating looks like, let's briefly talk about why one should incorporate.
Vamos a hablar por unos minutos sobre por qué uno debe de incorporar el negocio y después hablaremos de las cosas específicas.
The first and one of the primary reasons people choose to organize a business into some sort of legal entity is because of liability concerns.
La primera razón por qué las personas deciden incorporar su negocio es por la responsabilidad.
When you operate any sort of business, there's always concerns that some sort of liability may arise during the course of the business, and the concern is whether that liability could impact the individual owners of that business.
Cuando uno incorpora un negocio, significa que ese negocio es una entidad separada. O sea que cuando una responsabilidad ocurre en los ojos de la ley, el negocio es el que está impactado y no las personas que trabajan en el negocio o que empezaron el negocio.
It's sort of, in other words, stated in a different way, when you're an owner of a business, you want to ensure that your individual assets, your home, your personal assets, vehicles, anything that you own personally and your family owns is kept separate from the assets and liabilities of the business.
Por decirlo de otra manera, uno como negociante quiere saber que sus cosas, que su casa, su carro, todo lo que tengan y todo lo que tenga su familia es separado de lo que es el negocio.
When you organize certain types of legal entities, one of the benefits of certain types of legal entities that we'll talk about is that there is what's called a liability shield or limited liability protection, which means that if someone were to bring a claim or have some sort of a claim or liability against the business, that person could not get to the individual personal assets of the owners of that business.
Cuando uno organiza una entidad separada, lo que va a ser el negocio, eso significa que hay una responsabilidad limitada. O sea que si alguien quiere empezar problemas legales con el negocio, no pueden tocar sus asetos personales si incorporan el negocio como una entidad separada.
We'll talk more about how liability protection works in various types of entities in just a little bit, but let's move on down the list. The second item is taxes. How the income generated by a business, it can be subject to different types of rules concerning how that income is taxed.
Vamos a hablar un poco más de la responsabilidad en unos minutos, pero también hay otros beneficios de taxes si uno organiza o incorpora el negocio separado.
Probably one of the biggest distinctions between the types of legal entities as it relates to their tax implications are when you contrast a typical corporate tax versus a partnership tax or a limited liability company that is taxed as a partnership. The biggest distinction between those two is that with a corporation, there are oftentimes two separate layers of tax on the same dollar of revenue, meaning that the entity itself pays an income tax at the federal level, and then the individual owners of that corporation pay an income tax on those monies once they're distributed to the owners.
Los taxes son una diferencia, una de las muchas diferencias entre las entidades diferentes. Por ejemplo, con una corporación hay lo que se llama dos niveles de taxes, o sea que por el mismo dólar, la entidad paga un nivel de taxes y después el individuo que trabaja en la entidad tiene que pagar otro nivel de taxes en ese mismo dólar. O sea que los taxes son una manera de saber qué tipo de entidad quieren obtener para su negocio.
And again, just to draw the distinction to or from a entity that's taxed as a partnership, in a typical entity taxed as a partnership, you do not have those two layers of taxation, meaning that the entity level does not pay income tax. The individual owners of that entity pay income tax on their personal income tax returns. That the term typically used to describe that is pass-through taxation. The reason they use that term is because the income passes through the entity level without being taxed, which again is different from a corporation where the tax is assessed both at the entity level and the individual owner level.
Y solamente para dar otro ejemplo, hay otra entidad en la que uno no tiene que pagar taxes dobles. O sea que el dinero pasa de la entidad hasta el individuo que tiene su propio negocio y ese individuo tiene que pagar taxes. O sea que no tienen que pagar en los dos niveles, de la entidad y después el individuo, sino solamente el individuo. Y eso se llama pass-through tax. O sea que el dinero pasa desde la entidad hasta el individuo sin tener que pagar taxes.
The next reason to incorporate is has to do with the term or the length of time that the business will be in existence. Specifically, if you're simply doing business as what's called a sole proprietor, meaning just yourself engaging in business without any formal organization, the business would cease to exist once you passed away. If you choose to incorporate into an entity, entities obviously are not natural human beings, and therefore they, in theory, could last forever. So the existence, the length of time a business can exist is partly tied to whether it is incorporated and therefore could have a perpetual or long-term existence versus simply being an individual that once they passed away, the business would cease to exist.
Otra razón por la que deben de incorporar es la duración del tiempo en que el negocio puede ser una entidad. Por ejemplo, si uno no incorpora, ese negocio está basado en la vida de uno, o sea que cuando uno muere, también muere el negocio. Pero si uno incorpora, ese negocio se transforma en una entidad legal separada, entonces ese negocio puede continuar para siempre si uno quiere o después de que uno muera. Puede continuar por más tiempo.
The next reason for incorporating is the ability to transfer ownership of a business is made much easier when the business is and its assets are owned by an entity, because simply you can simply transfer the ownership interest in that entity from one person to another, versus if it's owned by just an individual, it becomes more difficult to transfer that ownership, for reasons that are a little bit beyond the context of this presentation, but the ownership simply is easier to transfer when it is held by a company or an entity versus an individual.
El derecho de tener como una parte del negocio es más fácil de transferir de una persona a otra cuando uno incorpora el negocio y el negocio se vuelve su propia entidad. Su propia persona en los ojos de la ley.
And to probably explain that a little further, I realize the word to transfer is probably not the most useful way to explain that. The better way to understand that would be if you want to sell, if you built a business and you wanted to sell that business in the future, it is much easier to do if it's owned by an entity, simply because the process, the legal mechanisms to transfer the ownership of that entity or the assets that entity owns is made easier if it's held by a company or an entity.
Por ejemplo, si uno tiene una compañía y quiere vender esa compañía en el futuro o ese negocio en el futuro, sería más fácil hacerlo si ese negocio, si el propietario de ese negocio es una entidad que no existe, si es una persona, solamente por problemas legales. Es más fácil transferir ese negocio de una persona a otra si no es parte de su entidad, si es una entidad separada.
The next reason to incorporate is it's easier, and I say easier somewhat in air quotes, is easier to raise money or capital in order to fund the growth of a business if you are incorporated into a type of business entity, because you have the capacity to sell an ownership stake in that business based on the type of legal entity you are operating within.
Es más fácil también obtener el dinero que uno necesita para crecer el negocio si uno ha incorporado el negocio, simplemente porque uno ya tiene la facilidad de poder darle a una persona una parte del negocio. Es el ejemplo del que estábamos hablando hace unos segundos. Entonces, por esa razón, personas van a querer invertir en la compañía y usted le puede dar una parte de la compañía también.
Tyler?
Yes.
Hi, this is Kim. We do have one question related to the perpetual existence point of incorporation. If LLCs perpetually exist, how do they transfer on past current ownership? For example, can they be passed to children?
Do you want me to let her translate that question, or do you want me to answer it?
I'm sure, Louisa, if you don't mind.
Yes. Hay unas entidades que son entre dos personas, que son unas asociaciones conjuntas. En inglés se llaman joint partnerships. Entonces ella está preguntando que si esas entidades se pueden transferir a los hijos de esas personas que son parte de esa entidad.
The answer is yes. Yes, you absolutely can pass the ownership interest, for example, in an LLC to your children, your heirs, because the ownership interest in a company is considered personal property. So you can pass it, for example, by your last will and testament.
Entonces, si uno tiene un LLC, que es un tipo de esas entidades de negocio, cuando uno los incorpora, se vuelve en este tipo de entidad, uno puede también pasar el interés que uno tiene en esa compañía a sus hijos.
And there's other arrangements that you could certainly structure to be able to leave a business ownership to a next generation. It's not uncommon for the owner of the business who has, children that they'd like to leave the business to over time begin transferring portions of the ownership interest to the next generation. And there's lots of different ways to structure that.
Hay muchas formas de hacer esto. Uno puede, por ejemplo, empezar a pasarle interés en el negocio poco a poco a través del tiempo, pero hay otras formas de hacerlo también. No es la única forma de pasar el interés en un negocio a la próxima generación.
The moving, unless there's another question about that particular topic, I'll move on to the next reason. The credibility, this is definitely one of the least important of the reasons, but there is some degree of I don't know credibility, I guess is the word, but some degree of professionalism, or at least the appearance of professionalism that is given by having an entity. It kind of tends to show the people you're dealing with, your customers, your clients, that you've taken the steps necessary to, formalize your business arrangement.
Al formalizar este negocio e incorporar el negocio, le da un aspecto de credibilidad a las personas que están usando el negocio o a las personas que están invirtiendo el negocio. Al menos, si no le da credibilidad, al menos le da como un aire de credibilidad, como les está mostrando que usted ha tomado unos pasos para darle credibilidad a su negocio.
The last main reason to incorporate, and this has varying degrees of importance to different people, privacy. When you form a business entity, it is, relatively easy to essentially conceal who the beneficial owners of that entity are. There's been some recent federal laws that are making that a little bit more difficult, which are sort of beyond the scope of this presentation. But that being said, you can, if you're an owner of a business and you do not want people to know that you own the business, there are ways you can structure that entity such that it would be very difficult to know who the actual owner was.
También hay un nivel de privacidad que uno puede tomar al incorporar el negocio. Algunas personas no quieren mantener su identidad privada si son los beneficiarios de ese negocio. Y eso se puede hacer. Tyler está diciendo que recientemente han hecho algunos cambios en las leyes que de pronto van a cambiar esto en el futuro, pero por ahora no ha cambiado mucho y todavía es posible mantener esta privacidad si uno lo quiere.
Right, we'll move on to the next slide. This slide summarizes the basic types of business entities within which you could conduct business.
Esta diapositiva que estamos viendo en este momento nos muestra los diferentes tipos de entidades que uno puede formar.
We'll jump in. The following slides are going to go through each one of these, so I'll go ahead and jump ahead. The first of which, the simplest of which, is a sole proprietorship, which is simply you individually doing business for yourself without any formal organization.
El primer tipo de entidad que acabamos de ver es lo que se llama una asociación sola. Eso significa que uno controla el negocio solo sin ningún tipo de organización legal.
The bottom line is you should never operate as a sole proprietor under any circumstances. That's my advice to anyone.
Sin embargo, uno nunca debe de hacer esto con su negocio simplemente porque hay más responsabilidad, aunque es conveniente y fácil no tener que registrar el negocio. Puede abrir muchas puertas malas que uno no quiere entrar. O sea que nunca deben de hacer este tipo de conjunta con su negocio.
The next type of entity is a general partnership. A general partnership is simply a sole proprietorship with two or more people.
Este tipo de asociación se llama asociación general y simplemente se llama así porque es un negocio entre dos personas.
The next type of, one more thing about general partnerships. Because they are just effectively a sole proprietorship with two or more people, again, my same suggestion would be you should never operate as a general partnership.
Asociaciones generales, como las que acabamos de ver, funcionan muy similares a ese primer tipo de entidad que vimos, en el que solamente es una persona. Sin embargo, uno nunca debe de operar su negocio de esa forma, una vez más, porque eso puede abrir muchas puertas legales que uno no quiere tocar.
The next type of entity is a limited partnership. Limited partnerships mean a limited partnership has at least one limited partner and at least one general partner. I'll explain what both of those are. I'll let Luisa interpret that part, and then I'll explain what those two are.
El siguiente tipo de entidad se llama un propietario limitado. Normalmente esto es formado por dos personas, con una persona que tiene una propiedad más limitada y la otra persona más general.
A general partner is just like a general partner in a general partnership. The general partner has unlimited personal liability for the obligations of the partnership. In other words, any obligation or liability that accrues to the partnership, the business, is the general partner is liable for that obligation personally.
El socio general tiene todos los mismos derechos, todas las mismas obligaciones que en las últimas entidades que hemos visto. Eso significa que ellos tienen la capacidad de manejar el negocio, pero también tienen las obligaciones del negocio.
A limited partner does not have any personal liability for the obligations or liabilities of the partnership. However, in exchange for that privilege or for that right, the limited partner has no right to participate in the operation and management of the partnership.
El socio limitado es una persona que le pone dinero a la compañía y no tiene los beneficios ni las obligaciones de la compañía en lo que es trabajar día a día con esa compañía. Sin embargo, tampoco tiene el beneficio de poder cambiar las cosas dentro de la compañía.
As far as taxes are concerned, limited partnerships are taxed under the partnership tax rules, which means that they have pass-through taxation. In other words, the entity partnership itself does not pay income tax at the entity level.
Este tipo de entidad en términos de taxes no tiene que pagar tantos taxes como las corporaciones. Tiene lo que llamamos el pass-through taxation, excuse me, en el que la corporación no tiene que pagar taxes, pero las personas que tienen la corporación sí pagan.
The next type of legal entity is a limited liability company. Limited liability companies, also referred to as LLCs, are the most prevalent type of business organization in today's business world.
Este tipo de entidad, que es el propietario, la responsabilidad limitada compañía, es el tipo de entidad que es más común el día de hoy.
And a limited liability company does require a formal organization paperwork to be filed. In North Carolina, that's called articles of organization. In other words, you have to fill out a form, which I'm going to jump ahead one slide. That's just an example of what the form looks like in North Carolina. You have to fill that form out and file it with the North Carolina Secretary of States in order to form an LLC in North Carolina.
Este tipo de entidad es lo que llamamos LLC, LLC, y es un tipo de entidad que combina lo que es el propietario limitado y también lo que son las corporaciones. Pero para formar este tipo de entidad, uno tiene que entregar papeles con el secretario de Carolina del Norte, y en el próximo en la próxima página nos ha mostrado Tyler un ejemplo de donde podemos encontrar ese papel. Do you mind going to the next slide, Tyler?
Yep.
Este solamente es un ejemplo y uno lo puede encontrar por este sitio web que está ahí.
One thing I didn't mention on the previous slide is that the owner, just terminology, the owners of an LLC are known as members. Just so you understand, when you hear the term member, it's the owner of the LLC.
El propietario de LLC no se llama propietario, sino que se llama miembro. O sea que si uno escucha la palabra miembro, no es una persona que simplemente no tiene responsabilidades ni nada dentro de la compañía, sino que es el propietario de la compañía.
The next item we're going to talk about for LLCs is liability. Specifically, the concept of limited liability as it applies to an LLC. The members and a term we haven't covered yet, but managers, the members and the managers of an LLC have limited liability protection. What this means is that the members and the managers of the LLC have no personal liability for the obligations of the LLC.
Las personas que están dentro de esta compañía, los propietarios, como hablamos, se llaman miembros y también se llaman gerentes, las personas que tienen un pedazo de esta compañía. Lo que nos acaba de decir el señor es que en este tipo de compañía tienen todos los beneficios de taxes que vimos antes con una compañía de propietarios limitados. O sea que tienen las mismas protecciones.
As I mentioned earlier, the term referred to used to refer to the people that actually operate the day-to-day of the LLC's business are known as managers. That's just a term used to refer to the people that operate the business of the LLC.
Las personas que operan la compañía, el negocio, son los gerentes. Eso es lo que se llaman. Una vez más, los propietarios, las personas que están al nivel más alto de la compañía se llaman miembros, y las personas que manejan la compañía día a día se llaman gerentes.
The document that controls the rights and responsibilities of the members and managers of an LLC is known as an operating agreement. In North Carolina, some states call it a limited liability company agreement, but that is the document or the contract between the members and the managers.
Hay un contrato entre los miembros y los gerentes que en muchos estados se llama Limited Liability Company, y en otros estados como Carolina del Norte se llama, Tyler, do you mind repeating one more time what it's called in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, it's called an operating agreement. In some states, it's called a limited liability company agreement.
Okay. Y en Carolina del Norte se llama un contrato operativo.
Taxes within an LLC. There are different options as far as how an LLC can be taxed, and it's primarily up to the owners or members of the LLC to notify the Internal Revenue Service how they want to be taxed.
Hay diferentes formas de que una de estas compañías de LLC pueda pagar taxes, y la compañía le tiene que decir a el IRS cómo quiere ser visto, cómo quiere pagar estos taxes.
There's three main typical ways an LLC can be taxed. If it's a single member LLC, meaning there's one owner, generally it's going to be what's called a disregarded entity, which means that the IRS does not even view from a tax standpoint that the LLC entity exists. They purely they attribute all income and loss to the individual single member.
Uno de estas opciones de la que uno puede escoger es LLC de un miembro. Eso significa que el IRS no ve a esta compañía de LLC como si fuera una compañía. Simplemente le pone todos los beneficios y todos las pérdidas del negocio del LLC en ese miembro.
The second way is if the LLC has two or more members, by default, it will be taxed under the partnership tax rules, which means that similar to the disregarded entity, what it means is that the IRS that there will be pass-through taxation such that the LLC entity does not pay tax at the entity level, but the members will pay tax at the individual level on their individual tax returns.
Otra opción de la que uno puede escoger para los taxes viene a ser una opción cuando hay dos o más miembros en la compañía. Cuando hay dos o más miembros, automáticamente empiezan a pagarles taxes de la forma en la que estábamos hablando más temprano. O sea que la compañía no paga taxes en lo que gana, sino que ese dinero pasa por la compañía sin que paguen taxes y viene a los miembros, y los miembros tienen que pagar taxes en ese dinero como normal.
The third typical way that an LLC will be taxed is what's referred to as a subchapter S election, or more commonly, people refer to it as an S Corp or S corporation. One common misunderstanding is that people will say, I have an S Corp, or my company is an S Corp. Well, that is not technically true because an S corp is not a type of legal entity. It is a tax status or a set of rules under which income is taxed at the federal level.
La tercera opción común para los taxes se llama un S corp o una corporación S. Muchas veces las personas dicen que yo tengo una corporación S o mi compañía es una corporación S, pero eso no es correcto porque una corporación S simplemente es, son unas reglas que uno sigue para poder pagar taxes. La forma en que uno paga los taxes no es una entidad en sí.
I'll spend a little more time talking about the subchapter S election simply because it is a preferred method for most small businesses operating as an LLC. The reason being is it provides a mechanism that allows you to reduce your I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Reduce the I won't use the tax that you pay as a business owner. There's a technical term referred to as FICA taxes, but I'm not going to get into that. But the taxes that you pay as a business owner can be reduced through the rules that allow the rules allowed under subchapter S election. I'll allow Luisa to interpret that part and then go further.
En las corporaciones S, vamos a hablar un poco más de este tipo de taxes, simplemente porque en los negocios pequeños muchas personas prefieren este tipo de taxes. Y eso es porque tienen una forma de hacer más pequeño lo que uno tiene que pagar en taxes. O sea, que reduce el dinero que uno tiene que pagar.
At a very basic level, the self-employment taxes that you pay as a business owner are tied to the salary that you pay yourself as an employee of your own business. And under the subchapter S rules, the self-employment tax is only applied to effectively your salary, what you pay yourself as a wage, and as opposed to any additional monies that you may receive from the business through, for example, distributions you make throughout the year or at the end of the year. With a subchapter S election, because the self-employment tax are paid only on your salary, you can reduce the self-employment tax burden by reducing your salary to a point where the actual self-employment tax is reduced substantially below what it would be if you were taxed as a partnership, where self-employment tax is applied to the entire amount of revenue that you receive as an owner, as opposed to simply the salary.
En las reglas del IRS hay lo que se llama un autoempleo, o sea que uno paga taxes sobre su propio empleo si uno trabaja por sí mismo, y esos taxes están juntos con lo que uno se paga de salario. O sea que si uno se paga un salario más alto, obviamente va a tener que pagar taxes más altos. Debajo de esta corporación es este tipo de taxes. Uno puede reducir lo que uno se paga de salario y así puede reducir sus taxes y no tener que pagar tanto en lo que gana la compañía, simplemente porque no es su salario, es otro tipo de ganancia. Normalmente, en otros tipos de entidades, uno tendría que pagar taxes sobre todas las ganancias de la compañía, pero este tipo de taxes, esta corporación S, nos deja reducir lo que vamos a pagar sobre los taxes de autoempleo.
While that is a a great tax savings method that a lot of people employ. Something to be aware of, the downside or negative of that strategy is your self-employment taxes are directly tied to, are largely made up of your Social Security contribution and your Medicare contribution. And therefore, if you reduce substantially your self-employment tax amount, you are reducing your contribution to Social Security, which means that when you go to draw Social Security, at retirement age, your overall benefit that you'll be eligible for is going to be substantially reduced. So what that means from a business owner standpoint is the money that you're saving in taxes during your working years need to be set aside or invested in a way that is accessible to you when you're retirement age, because that money needs to essentially replace the money you would be getting from Social Security.
El único problema con este tipo de taxes de la corporación S que reduce lo que uno tiene que pagar en taxes por el autoempleo es que los taxes que uno paga debajo del autoempleo va en parte a Social Security y Medicare. O sea que si uno paga menos dinero en taxes, cuando uno va a retirar ese dinero, cuando uno ya tiene 65 y puede retirar el dinero de Social Security, va a ser menos. Uno tiene una cuenta con menos dinero. Eso significa que si uno va a pagar menos taxes durante este tiempo, ese mismo dinero que uno pagaría en taxes si no está reduciendo su autoempleo, debe de ir a una cuenta de retiro para que cuando uno se retire pueda tener dinero que ha estado guardando, ha estado poniendo en otras compañías y todo eso, para que cuando uno se retire, esa cuenta de Social Security más baja no le dé tan duro.
So in summary, with regard to LLCs are by far the best vehicle as far as an entity within which to engage in especially a small and medium-sized business. So it would be the way I would almost always suggest that you consider for smaller and medium-sized businesses.
LLCs son el mejor tipo de entidad que uno puede tener para compañías pequeñas y medianas. Entonces nos está diciendo el señor que uno debe de escoger ese tipo de entidad para esas compañías más pequeñas y medianas.
The next type of legal entity is a corporation. A corporation has some of the same benefits of an LLC, but it also has some rigidness to it that makes them less flexible and than an LLC.
El siguiente tipo de entidad es una corporación. Tiene muchos de los beneficios que un LLC tiene. Sin embargo, es más rígido, no tiene tanta flexibilidad.
The first thing with similar to an LLC, you have to actually file paperwork in order to form a corporation. In most states, that's referred to as an articles of incorporation.
Como un LLC, para formar una corporación, uno tiene que entregar papeles al Estado y en muchos estados se llaman artículos de incorporación.
Also, with similar to an LLC, the owners and officers of a corporation are have limited liability protection. In other words, the owners and officers and directors of a corporation do not have personal liability for the obligations of the LLC.
Similar.
Or sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry. I realized I said I meant obligations of the corporation. I apologize.
Similar a un LLC, las personas que tienen interés en la corporación no tienen propietarios limitados, o sea que las cosas que ellos tienen personalmente y que la familia tiene no forma parte de la corporación y así si algo pasa con la corporación, nadie puede quitarles esas cosas.
Just briefly explain the structure of a corporation. It's basically three levels. You have your owners, known as shareholders. Then you have the owners or the shareholders elect the board of directors, who are in charge of making high-level management decisions. And then you have the officers, who are appointed by the board of directors, and the officers are typically in charge of running the day-to-day operations of the corporation.
Hay diferentes tipos de personas dentro de una corporación. De primeras tenemos lo que se llama en inglés shareholders. Eso significa las personas que tienen una parte de la compañía. Son propietarios de la compañía. Ellos tienen un grupo de directores que ellos pueden escoger por forma de voto y ese grupo de directores puede escoger oficiales. Esos oficiales van a ser las personas que trabajan en el negocio día a día y que hacen todo lo que el negocio tiene que hacer todos los días.
I've already touched on the tax of a corporation, but I'll just briefly reiterate that taxes with a corporation usually work one of two ways. A traditional what's called C corporation has double taxation, meaning that the income is taxed at both the entity level, the corporate level, as well as when that money is distributed to the shareholders. The shareholders then pay tax at the individual level. The other way is the subchapter S, which is what we already talked about with regard to LLCs.
Las corporaciones pueden trabajar de dos formas cuando uno ve los taxes. Una forma se llama C corporación. Eso significa que el dólar le tienen que pagar taxes dos veces. La corporación paga taxes de primeras, después pasa a los propietarios, que son los accionistas, los shareholders, y ellos tienen que pagar otra vez en lo que ellos ganan. Otros tipos de entidades de corporaciones se llaman S corporaciones y eso solamente se paga taxes los accionistas, o sea que no paga la corporación y los accionistas. Sin embargo, hay ciertas limitaciones que trabajan cuando uno quiere formar una corporación S.
There's some discussion about a B corporation. It's something that is very infrequent, so I'm not going to cover that for the sake of time.
Hay otro tipo de corporación que se llama B corporación, pero eso no pasa muy regular y por el tiempo que ya se nos está acabando, vamos a seguir.
This slide just shows you a breakdown of all the different types of entities that we covered and the basic characteristics by category.
Esta diapositiva solamente nos muestra los diferentes tipos de entidades que uno puede formar y qué son las características de cada una de esas entidades.
Once you've picked the structure, you've formed the entity, typically the next step is to obtain what's called an EIN or employer identification number. This is effectively the social security number for your entity.
Cuando escogen su entidad legal, lo que tienen que hacer es obtener el Employer Identification Number o el número de identificación del empleador. Eso es como el Social Security Number, el número social de la entidad.
And you'll need a EIN for your business entity in order to open a bank account in the name of the entity.
Van a necesitar este número para abrir una cuenta bancaria en el nombre de esta entidad.
The next step after forming the entity, obtaining an EIN, is normally to memorialize some sort of what I call internal governance document. This is just a contract between the owners of the business.
El siguiente paso después de formar su entidad y obtener el número de identificación es hacer unos documentos de gobernanza interna. Eso solamente es un contrato entre las personas que son propietarias de esa compañía, de ese negocio.
As it's indicated on the slide, the operating agreement is the name of the document of a contract between the members of an LLC. Bylaws are the contract, as it were, that for a corporation between that impacts the rights and responsibilities of the shareholders and the officers and the directors. And then the partnership agreement is the same thing as an operating agreement, except for a general or limited partnership.
Este contrato se puede llamar diferentes cosas y uno puede ver en esta diapositiva que se llama una cosa para un LLC, que es un contrato operativo. Se llama otra cosa diferente para las corporaciones, que son bylaws en inglés, y para los conjuntos comerciales se llaman un contrato del conjunto.
Because LLCs are the most typical type of entity you're going to use, I'm going to spend more time talking about operating agreements than anything else. An operating agreement deals with a lot of key issues, such as, who's in charge of the management, how are those responsibilities divided.
Este tipo de contrato del que acabamos de hablar va a tener mucha información sobre cómo se va a organizar la entidad. El primer tipo de contrato, que es un contrato operativo que se va a usar en LLCs, tiene provisiones importantes de cómo se organiza.
Also things like the transfer of ownership interest in the LLC. That can be very important if you have multiple owners and someone wants to transfer their interest. What are the rules around transferring an ownership interest?
También va a tener información no solo de cómo se organiza la compañía, sino también cómo se va a transferir. Eso es muy importante, especialmente si hay diferentes propietarios de la compañía y quieren poner reglas de cómo se va a transferir el interés que esas personas tienen en la compañía a otras personas, a otras generaciones, si uno quiere.
Other items that are important that are covered by an operating agreement, the actual ownership interest, the ownership structure of the company, and along with that, the capital contributions, which is the amount of money or property that the members put into the company when it's formed.
También va a tener información de cómo los propietarios van a estar estructurados dentro de la compañía y también cuánto dinero o cuánta propiedad van a dar esas personas para iniciar la compañía.
Distributions, how are you going to get paid? That's obviously very important. You want to know as an owner, how are monies that the LLC has earned and retained, not spent on operations. How and when are those distributed?
También van a haber distribuciones. Eso significa cómo se van a pagar los propietarios, cómo les va a pagar la compañía. Eso es muy importante para poder saber cómo va a salir ese dinero de lo que gana la compañía.
A buy-sell provision deals with what happens if someone wants out of the company. So, for example, if you and a business partner are operating a business for a number of years and one of you decides they want to retire, how does that work? How does the process of you getting out of the company work? If you don't provide for a process and the parties decide they don't agree on how it's going to work, the only way you're getting out of that company is through a lawsuit, and that's expensive and eats up the revenue and assets of the business.
También tienen que que incluir provisiones que hablan de cómo puede salir una persona de la compañía. Por ejemplo, si uno quiere retirarse y es una compañía de varios propietarios, uno va a querer uno va a querer saber cómo vender el interés que uno tiene en la compañía o cómo una persona puede comprar el interés. ¿Cuáles son las reglas que tiene que ver con eso? Eso va a ser muy importante porque si una persona se quiere retirar o ya no quiere ser parte de la compañía y no tienen una provisión que habla del proceso, de cómo hacer eso, pueden salirse solamente con un proceso de la corte y eso les va a costar mucho dinero, les va a costar mucho tiempo y eso no es lo que van a querer hacer.
So a little bit more about operating agreements. These are not public documents. These are internal contracts between the owners of the business. It's very important that you understand what is in an operating agreement. An operating agreement can seem daunting because they tend to be dozens of pages in length, and that scares people away sometimes. But understand that it is important to have one in place if you have more than one member of your LLC, because again, everyone gets along when they're starting a business, but at a business partnership, is frankly similar to a marriage, and at some point, if the partners don't get along anymore, if you don't have a contract in place, the consequences are you're going to end up having to hire a lawyer to sue one another to sort out your differences.
Esto es muy importante tenerlo. No son documentos públicos, sino que son contratos privados de la compañía. Sin embargo, uno va a querer tener eso si hay más de una persona que es propietario de una compañía. Un negocio entre dos personas es como si fuera un matrimonio. Uno tiene un matrimonio excelente durante los tiempos felices, pero si no llegan a ser felices, van a querer tener un proceso de divorcio entre la compañía.
Some other considerations in operating your business. Protecting your assets is obviously very important. And this is depending on how you fund the startup and financing of your business, this could have very different structures. But for example, if you're actually funding the startup of your own business, you should treat that investment much like if you went to a third-party bank and they lent you the money to start your business. That bank would very likely, make you sign a document that would say you are agreeing to pay this money back, and they would place a lien against the assets that the business purchases with that loan. And even if you're not obtaining a third-party loan and you're funding your own startup, you should treat your business at arm's length and as if you were, a lender of your business.
Uno debe de estar como propietario de su negocio, tratando el negocio como si fuera una entidad separada por completo, como si uno fuera un banco que le está poniendo dinero a una compañía separada. Eso les va a proteger sus propias cosas que son separadas del negocio. Aunque no estén tomando dinero de un banco, deben de tratar su propio dinero, su propia inversión como si fuera de otra persona.
The other part on this slide that I just want to briefly mention is always have contracts for everything. When I say everything, anytime you are exchanging consideration means anything of value, whether that's money or property, or services. If you're giving or getting something of value, there needs to be a document, even if it's a very simple document, that explains what that agreement is. So as it says there, good contract, kind of like people say, good fences make good neighbors, good contracts make good relationships.
siempre deben de tener un contrato. Aunque estén dando cualquier cosa de valor poca, aunque estén vendiendo algo, que estén comprando algo, que estén dando cualquier cosa que tiene algún valor, ya sea un servicio, una propiedad, dinero, lo que sea, deben de tener contratos.
I know we're supposed to be around the hour mark for the whole thing. I'm barely halfway through these slides, so I'm gonna kind of skip over things that are of less importance just so we can cover a little more ground. And if there's any questions that come up or any questions someone wants to ask, please jump in and do that. I'll hit on the high marks as I go through here.
Como ya se nos está acabando el tiempo, vamos a pasar algunas diapositivas y hablar de las cosas más importantes. Y si tienen preguntas, por favor, no duden en preguntar.
So when it comes to employment issues, there's lots of federal and state laws that come into play when you have employees. Understanding, basic minimum wage and overtime rules is very important. Making sure that I think it might be on a later slide, but things like workers' compensation insurance, that making sure you understand your obligation to pay for that and to report that to the state.
Sabiendo todas las leyes que uno debe de cumplir cuando uno tiene empleados, también es muy importante. Sabiendo cuál es el pago mínimo, las leyes de trabajar extra, las leyes con aseguranza, todo eso es muy importante.
Again, if you're selling any goods or services, you need to understand your obligation to remit sales tax. Even if you're selling things online, that's still you're still required to pay that. Again, if you have employees, making sure that you're properly withholding taxes from their wages and remitting that to the appropriate authorities.
También tienen que saber las leyes de taxes. Si están vendiendo algo, aunque sea por el internet, tienen que pagar tax de vender algo. También si tienen empleados, tienen que tomar el dinero de taxes y pagar ese dinero del salario de sus empleados.
We'll skip ahead a little bit here. Other, again, considerations, making sure, depending on what county or city you're in, what there may be licenses or permits you're required to have in order to operate. Another very important thing is you don't need a lawyer to start a small business. You do, in my opinion, need an accountant. So your first stop, always my suggestion is, if you have to choose between a lawyer and an accountant, go with a lawyer 100% of the time.
Algunas cosas que uno debe de tomar en cuenta. Necesitan en algunas ciudades y algunos estados permisos de la ciudad o de el condado o del estado, entonces tienen que averiguar esas cosas. También no necesitan a un abogado para empezar una compañía, pero sí van a necesitar un contador. O sea que si van a escoger entre un abogado y un contador, escojan el contador.
I realized I said that backwards. An accountant is more critical to a startup business than a lawyer. Sorry, I misspoke.
I got you. Es más importante un contador que un abogado.
Also, having workplace policies in place. If you have a business and you're have more and more employees, having workplace policies, written policies, is very important, especially in today's society. Things like workplace harassment and discrimination are becoming far more prevalent as far as the reporting of them. And if you don't have written policies in place, you're setting yourself up for a potential issue down the road.
También deben de tener pólizas que han escrito de cómo van a comportarse los empleados y los propietarios dentro del trabajo. En el día de hoy hay que tener todo esto escrito.
The last section, I believe this whole last section of slides deals with intellectual property considerations. I'll just briefly touch on this and then see if anyone has any questions. Depending on the nature of your business, the intellectual assets of a business oftentimes in today's world are worth far more than the physical assets. Again, if you have a company that where the brand, the name, the brand, the logo of it is what what draws people to the business or what is of great value, then protecting that is just as valuable as protecting the physical assets of the business. And that's done through one of several ways. There's different types of intellectual property protections, such as patents, copyrights, and trademarks being the main ones. The one that I think is of most value to most small businesses is trademarks, because they're relatively inexpensive to obtain. If you have a name or logo that you would like to claim, so to speak, to make it proprietary, then I would certainly suggest exploring a trademark.
Algunas otras cosas que uno debe de considerar es que la propiedad intelectual de su negocio muchas veces va a ser más importante que el negocio propio. Hay diferentes tipos de propiedad intelectual. Uno es patentar, otro es derechos de autor, otro es secretos de comercio y otro es la marca comercial. Tyler nos está diciendo que la marca comercial puede ser la más fácil de obtener porque no cuesta tanto dinero y va a ser muy importante para su comercio. Eso es, si uno quiere que el nombre del negocio o que una marca, un color sea propio del negocio, uno tiene que pasar por ese proceso. O sea que eso es algo que uno tiene que considerar.
I believe the rest of these, I'm just going to quickly flip through them. The rest of these slides really go into a much deeper dive about intellectual property, which is, it's good information. I would definitely read through it, but it's probably beyond the scope of kind of this basics of business entrepreneurship. And I believe that is the case. Yeah, there's a last thing in here is there's some good resources that are linked on the last few pages of these slides for small business startups that I'd suggest you having a look at. Otherwise, I'm happy to address any questions that anyone might have.
En las últimas páginas de esta diapositiva va a hablar mucho más específicamente de qué es la propiedad intelectual, qué son cada tipo de propiedad y cómo pueden proteger esa propiedad intelectual. Después, al final, hay unos recursos que ustedes pueden ver. Si ven esta diapositiva en el sitio web, después deben de mirar esos recursos para ver si algo les puede ayudar. Y si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, por favor, escríbanlo en el chat y le podemos contestar.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Louisa, for today's really amazing presentation. There was so much information there. For those who are watching, we have recorded this presentation and we will post it on the NC Leaps program page along with the slides to this presentation. I will drop the link to that program page in our chat. We have just a short time for any questions. If you have a question for Tyler, please drop that into the chat or the Q&A now.
Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, pónganlo en el chat. Ella también ha puesto el sitio web en el que podemos encontrar este video que tomamos de la presentación y va a estar el video en ese sitio web cuando terminemos.
It looks like no questions for us in the chat. I just want to say again, thank you, Tyler and Louisa, for joining us today. This was a really, really great presentation, and will create a really, really wonderful resource for our NC LEAP clients. Thank you to everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now, and